When I was little, I wanted to be a midwife, but I gave that idea up long before I finished secondary school. Biology was just not my subject. I leave science to others. Why am I telling you this when I call myself a family and social historian? Everybody that I have ever researched and everybody who has ever asked me to do any research have all got something in common with me and with you. We have all been born. And as a social historian, one thing that really intrigues me is the customs that our ancestors associated with childbirth. Some, when we look back on them with modern eyes, are quite sensible and rational and maybe an improvement on what we do today, and others are just plain weird. How did I come across the book that I'm going to talk about today? One of my other hobbies is writing. I write for fun. I don't want to be published. It's just something I do to amuse myself. And in recent years I have ended up working on a sort of mini-series that is set in the 1850s and 1860s, and the setting is an aristocratic home. The young lord of the house is trying to expand the family library that his ancestors have been adding to for centuries. What would his ancestors have put in their library? What would they have bought? I began to look back on the most obvious source of information, historic newspapers, to see what was published, what was being advertised, new books, and this is how I ended up discovering this book by Jane Sharp. On the 28th of May 1724, the book was mentioned in the Stamford Mercury. Now the long title is really typical of its time, but I was fascinated. It is 1724 and somebody has bothered to write what seems to be a guide to midwifery, and I want to read it. I have got to find a copy of this. I want to read it. I didn't find a digital version. I hoped it would be on Google Books, but I did learn that the complete Midwife's Companion was effectively a reprint of the original volume, the Midwives Book. It was a practical guide to midwifery. It was published by Jane Sharp, actually went into print in the year 1671. Now, how often do you find a contemporary book explaining how our 17th century ancestors managed pregnancy and birth? It's still in print. It's the most expensive paperback I have ever bought, but as a historian I call these kind of things an investment, and honestly it is a gold mine, and this is why I want to tell you about it. Now, as a family historian, you might say that you have a bit of an advantage when you're trying to find out something about somebody who wrote a book in the past, because I know where to look for births, marriages, baptisms, burials, death, but are those skills enough to help me find out who this Mrs. Jane Sharp was? I've started with the most obvious resource I could think of and put her name into Google, and of course I got Wikipedia. According to Wikipedia, Jane Sharp was born in around 1641. She came from Shropshire, allegedly. But when her book was published in 1671, she said she had been a practitioner in the art of midwifery for above 30 years. So she wasn't born in 1641, she was practising as a midwife in 1641. Treat Wikipedia with caution if you are a historian, and even if you're not. She was an adult in 1641, so I'm guessing at a birth year somewhere between probably the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 and the Mayflower sailing in 1620. So by the time Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, I imagine that she was probably 45 to 50 years old. It is entirely possible that Jane was from outside London, but the Midwives Book was printed by Simon Miller, who operated from the Star at the West End of St Paul's in London. and from what I've been able to find out, he was printing books from at least 1659 to at least 1680, which is exactly the period you would want him to be in business if he was the one who printed Jane's book. So to me it makes sense that she chose a local business, somebody she lived near, somebody maybe recommended by a friend, or maybe in fact Simon Miller is a friend of her family. The name on the title page is also interesting. Mrs. Jane Sharp. Now at the time, Mrs. was a common abbreviation for mistress, and this was often applied to any adult woman, whether they were married or single, just a bit like we would use Ms. today. But my instinct tells me that a midwife would be more likely to be married or perhaps widowed than single. This then tells you we've got to find a Jane who's marrying a Mr. Sharp at some point probably before 1641. And the trouble is, there are plenty of candidates. So any or none of these locations are possible. And one thing you might want to bear in mind is that although Shrewsbury seems to be a long way from London, they're actually both linked by the A5, part of which, even on today's maps, seems to be known by the old Roman name of Watling Street. It's a Roman road. If you plot it out on a modern map, it actually comes to 151 miles. So if you walk 3 miles an hour at an average pace, you could actually do that in a week if you really wanted to. So let us suppose that Jane Sharp is born in 1615. She gets married somewhere between 1632 and 1640. Parish records tell us that there are quite a few possibilities in the London area which would fit if that's where she was living when she got her book printed. A widow named Joan Sharp is buried at Stepney on the 9th of September 1689. Another Jane Sharp is buried at Whitechapel on the 28th of October 1699, but I've discounted her because she was a child. Both locations are about 3 miles from St Paul's Church at Covent Garden, and also just over 2 miles from St Paul's Cathedral, the famous one. So they're all within walking distance really. But what's really interesting is that 3 Jane Sharps are buried at St Martin in the Fields between 1680 and 1700, which is a quarter of a mile from Covent Garden. It's about a mile from St Paul's Cathedral, just to the left of Charing Cross Station. So from the limited information that I have been able to find out here, I don't even pretend this is an exhaustive search, it's what I've been able to find from a little bit of internet research. I am favouring the Jane Sharp who was buried in 1694. If that's her, if we take it she was born somewhere around 1615 to 1620, she's about 75 to 80 years old, which is reasonable. If she's earning her own money as a midwife, she's probably not particularly rich. She hasn't got a private income. So maybe she begins without formal training, because formal training doesn't exist. She starts by delivering her friends' and neighbours' babies, maybe in the late 1630s, 1640s. Maybe she went to, give them support during childbirth, and slowly built up a reputation as somebody who was caring and level-headed, and people recommended her to others, so ask Jane to help you when the baby comes, she knows what she's doing. She really does seem like the kind of person who knows her subject. I do wonder, in the time that she's living in, there was no state pension, no old age pension in those days. It's nearly 250 years away. So has she actually published the Midwives Book? Because she's approaching her 50s, which is probably quite a good age for somebody who has probably lived through the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London a few years previously. Has she published it as a pension scheme? Is it so that when she becomes too old or infirm to be able to deliver babies, she might have a stroke or lose her vision or something of that kind that stops her from being able to practice? Is the book going to provide her with an income because it's going to carry on selling? That might be the answer. That's going to provide her with cash, in theory. The subtitle of the book is The Whole Art of Midwifery Discovered. And there are two separate dedications at the beginning, and I think it does show you that Jane thought of her craft, if you will, as an art. It was a specialist subject. It's something that you need to know how to practice in a safe and competent manner. It's not just something that anybody can do. So the first dedication is to a Lady Eleanor Talbot. The footnotes in the book suggest that she was a sister of the 10th Earl of Shrewsbury, who was born in 1601. Apparently there is a reference in the College of Arms records to the 10th Earl having a sister named Eleanor, so if she didn't get married, that's possibly her. There's no actual reference to Eleanor Talbot on the peerage website, which is really good for looking up any kind of aristocratic connections in Britain. We are assuming from the book that Eleanor is alive and unmarried when Jane publishes her book in 1671. It's possible if she had a brother born in 1601, definitely. Could it be that Lady Eleanor actually helped Jane out with the printing costs? Maybe she did. But her main audience is actually not the aristocracy, it's the midwives of England. She calls them her sisters. She explains in her introduction that she is really saddened to think of the miseries that women endure, please ignore my cat, in the hands of unskillful midwives, especially those who are motivated by money and don't understand anatomy. I don't think she's criticising those women that aren't particularly skilled who practice as midwives. I think she recognises that women are helping each other out, and some are better than others, and you don't know what's going to happen during the process of childbirth. She's not criticising them. She's writing this book because she wants to share her experiences. She wants to help women understand how their bodies work. She wants to educate them. So I think she sees midwifery as a vocation, but it's also one that requires knowledge and certain specialist skills. And this then leads me to wonder, I wonder how many people who actually bought this book were women. How many women could read? Midwifery is definitely a female occupation, a female domain. So how many of her audience can read? Is it the case that there's one literate midwife in the area who buys it and reads it aloud to other midwives who aren't so literate, and they're sharing knowledge that way? I mean, this is a substantial book. This is the Midwives Book. It's, you know, it's not a quick flick through. It's bulky, and it's got a female target audience. So for the 1670s, that is such a radical idea. And in one of my next videos, I'm going to talk a bit more about other things that I found in the Midwives Book. This is just a little taster, and I hope it won't be long before I actually get those videos up and running.